This is the first, and what I hope will be an ongoing series of brief research updates and informational updates for staff here at Beacon Services. The first topic I'm going to give you an update on is something basically which you are all familiar with, social stories as an intervention. In the past couple of months and over the past year, there have been a number of studies and evaluations of social stories as an intervention. And what I want to do is give you an update as to where the research is so you're aware and have the most current information about that. But first, let's talk about what social stories are. They're important for you to understand that social stories are an antecedent intervention. They're something we do before we actually engage in the behavior in an effort essentially to get the behavior we're interested in to happen. It's important because it really is a review of the expectations of desired behavior, what we'd like them to do. They are not prompts to do specific behavior, although we may think of them that way. They are really a review of the rules that we're actually asking people to engage in. Follow this rule, do this in this context. It is essentially a knowledge intervention more than it is a behavioral intervention. In order to really understand social stories and the evaluation I'm going to talk about in a minute, we'll have to go back and talk about what Carol Gray, who's the primary author and the originator of the idea of social stories, talked about. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I want you to get the sense that when someone writes a social story, and as Carol Gray defines them, it's all about these antecedent things that we're going to do. We're going to try to write down a story that shares meaningful information about what we'd like that person to do in typically a format that is, as Carol Gray say, reassuring. And she uses the term patient. We're going to talk about kids. But we're going to let them know we're going to go somewhere and it's going to be fun. It's going to be okay. Basically, the goal sort of is to reduce anxiety, hypothetically. It's going to introduce the place we're going to go, the things we might do, how it's going to start, what's going to happen in the middle, and how it's going to end. We have all those elements. It summarizes the whole activity. There may be some WH questions. Yeah, if so-and-so does this, what are you going to do? We're going to do this. Or where are we going to go? When is this going to happen? What happens next? A lot of WH questions are typically in social stories and the answers to them. It's typically written, if you follow Carol Gray's guidelines, in the form of from the perspective of the person doing it. I'm going to go to the dentist's office. I will see the dentist. He'll be wearing a mask, and that will be okay. And those kinds of things. We're going to go to the store, and if it's loud, I can do X. Typically written, again, from the perspective of the person who's engaging in the behavior. It uses positive language, and it usually omits references to problem behavior, talks about what the person's supposed to do. At least that's how Carol Gray has defined them. Some other elements would be descriptive language related to other activities. This is going to be good, or the room will be dark, but that's okay, or it may be loud, but that's okay. Again, those elements. It really describes what's going to happen rather than says, next you will have to do the next behavior. And it's theoretically at least tailored in terms of language and flow, structure, complexity to a person with the particular challenges that our kids have. It may or may not include pictures. And when people make social stories, they often include pictures of the individual themselves, the location they're going to, the materials they may be using. Not required, but it's typically components of a social story. You'll notice I've described all of the things that will occur essentially prior to you actually being in that location. Social stories are used to set the occasion for better behavior. Often because the person's engaging in problem behavior when they go to the dentist's office, the doctor's, the store, the restaurant, grandma's house, whatever location in the community. And sometimes they're used essentially to introduce an activity that person has never done before. You often see people using these to explain a vacation. They've never gone to Disney World. We want to make sure they know that there'll be lines we're going to have to wait. They're going to see certain things or go to certain places. So they often used either to remediate bad behavior or to introduce a new activity or change in hopes that the person will respond, in both cases, more successfully. That's how they're used. Now let's talk about how they're implemented in reality. Most people do that antecedent review of that. Prior to going to the thing, we review those expectations, the rules, the sequence of activity, and again, how we'd like them to feel about it. And that can be done once, twice, a bunch of times. People do that, in some cases, multiple times before the activity. As I've said before, and I really want to make the point clearly, it's an antecedent intervention. But when people research social stories, when they've done their literature reviews and done analyses, they don't just typically look at social stories. They typically look at the social story, and then when that social story is delivered and the person's in the context of the activity, often they're prompted to engage in a particular behavior, reminded of a rule, behaviors modeled, they're shown pictures of the activity. Essentially what we're talking about is prompts, whether they be visual prompts, verbal prompts, modeling prompts, to engage in the behavior you'd like them to do. And if they in fact do that, often they deliver reinforcement for completion of those skills or behaviors that you're interested in. So when you talk about an evaluation of social stories, you're really not evaluating social stories, you're evaluating social stories plus modeling, plus prompting, plus reinforcement. And so when you looked at those studies, you say some of them say social stories are effective, some say they're not. Well, recently a number of people have gone back and said, you know what, social stories is an intervention, modeling is an intervention, prompting is an intervention, reinforcement's an intervention. What aspect of social stories is responsible, or at least the implementation of them is responsible for these changes? Is it the modeling, the prompting, social stories, all of them combined? And so they've done what's referred to as a component analysis. In the January to March 2013 issue of Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders, RASD, there's a great component analysis of social stories. I was recently at the California ABA conference where one of the presenters did a component analysis of social stories, and they looked at the implementation of social stories alone on the targeted behaviors, the implementation of social stories plus prompting and reinforcement, and then the implementation of simply prompting and reinforcement alone without the presentation of social stories. And what they found is when you simply implement social stories without those other components, you see little or no change in the behavior. You don't see the performances occur that you're looking for are targeted in the context of the social story. And that's a real problem. That only occurred in both component analyses when prompting and reinforcement occurred. And in fact, when you just do prompting and reinforcement and skip the social story, you get the targeted behaviors that you like to occur and continue to occur. So what the really conclusion here is that social stories aren't effective in doing anything. The perception that they're effective is often simply because we do additional things. The phrase that might be helpful here is that they're neither necessary nor sufficient to get the change. Done without prompting for the specific behavior, visual cues, verbal cues, direct instruction of some kind, physical prompts, and reinforcement for engaging the behavior, they don't work. At least 2 studies so far have had that same outcome. So most of you, many of you, are probably implementing social stories routinely with your kids, suspecting that they in fact are an evidence-based practice. But when we get those outcomes, it is not because of the social story. It is because of the other additional procedures, prompting and reinforcement that we apply. Our goal is this behavior change. Well, we need to know what actually produces it, don't we? So these component analyses are really important. But people love the idea of social stories. They seem really positive and pleasant and nice. Parents are often on board. And many of you spend really a tremendous amount of time putting together a complex, multi-instruction, visually attractive social story in a belief that this is really important for your kids. Unfortunately, the data don't really support that. And when you think about it, most of our kids, if you explain a rule before engaging in some behavior, for instance, tell them, we're going to go play with Johnny and Susie, you need to use nice words, or there's no hitting, blah, 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 any of those kinds of things. For our kids, they do not work. So why would social stories work? They're the same intervention. They're simply a restatement of the rule antecedent to the intervention, or to the actual behavioral condition. That doesn't work for our kids. We know this. And so intuitively, if we actually look at social stories, we'd realize that why would they work? They really require those other components. And so we just want to make sure that you're aware, not saying that you should never use visual cues to rehearse a routine and reinforce that. You should. Understand, though, the efficacy of these interventions are a function of the effective response prompts in the context of the routine and reinforcement for engaging in the response, not the activity schedule itself, not that antecedent piece. Useful, interesting, but doesn't produce an outcome. It may be helpful for you to do social stories to get parents to follow a predictable schedule routine that you've established, and it's a cue for the parents to follow that routine and to use specific phrases or reinforcement for correct responding or to model the desired behavior. They may be useful for parent prompting, but if you think social stories are effective, then you are literally unfamiliar with the research on them and why they should or shouldn't work. conceptually, it makes actually perfectly logical sense that they don't work. And so, remember, you're a behavior analyst. You've got to be able to be familiar with the importance, A, of database decision making. Why use social stories if the data says they are not effective? Or use them with the support to make them effective if you are going to, actually take the time to put these things together. And it's important for you to be aware of current research, because you may be thinking how important it is, and you may have a parent who says he needs a social story for this. What he really needs is response prompts for the behavior, or she needs, and reinforcement for doing those behaviors. Those are the most critical elements. And if you focus on the wrong piece, you might not get a good outcome. Is it because social stories don't work? Yes. But do you know how to make it work, or how to ensure that the desired behavior actually does occur? So, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at bross@beaconservices.org. And I hope to hear from some of you. Take care.